a lioness who lost every cub she ever bore, a zookeeper still carrying the echo of her mother's grief, 5 piglets painted like cubs in a last attempt to save a dying heart, and a moment quiet, unexpected, when the lioness licked the smallest piglet and chose to live again. This isn't just a story about animals. It's about how miracles are often born not from grand gestures, but from love that refuses to give up. Before we begin this unforgettable story, would you mind sharing where you're from in the comments? And if stories of love, loyalty, and second chances move you, please give this video a like and consider subscribing. Windermere, Oregon. Late winter. The zoo lay under a soft, unbroken sky of slate gray, and a biting breeze wandered between the fir trees like a ghost, unsure of where it belonged. Morning mist clung to the edges of enclosures, turning the steel bars to silver and the concrete to damp shadow. In the heart of Windermere Zoo, past the pathways lined with weather-worn plaques and empty strollers, behind a viewing glass streaked by children's fingers and yesterday's rain, there was a cage where silence had taken root. Savannah, the lioness who once roared like thunder through this corner of the park, now lay still, her frame curled into herself like a forgotten statue. She was 8 years old, her body large and powerful, yet softened by weight loss and neglect. Her fur, once rich with vitality and the hue of deep sunlit gold, had dulled to the shade of wheat left too long in the sun. Her great amber eyes, once glinting with something close to majesty, now held no light, no focus, just a void of memory and loss. She had been Windermere's pride, its beating heart behind glass. Guests would linger, hushed and wide-eyed, as she prowled with silent grace or stretched on the rocks like a queen surveying her domain. Children squealed when she yawned, exposing teeth like carved ivory. Couples would whisper beside her enclosure, pointing at her regal stance as she stood in the early morning fog. But those days were gone. Savannah had given birth 3 times over the past 2 years, and each time, her cubs were born lifeless, perfectly shaped but silent, their tiny bodies unmoving, their fur never rising with breath. There was no roaring celebration, no tender cleaning, no warm pile of golden fluff to cradle, only stillness. The caretakers had taken them away gently. With gloved hands and voices that shook, Savannah, each time, had stared into the corner of her den for hours after, as though waiting for her mind to catch up to what her body already knew. After the 3rd loss, something inside her changed. She stopped pacing, stopped responding. She refused food, first the processed meats, then the raw portions she used to favor, until not even fresh chicken stirred her nostrils. The staff tried offering her warm water, herbal scents, even the soft cooing voices she once tolerated. Nothing reached her. She curled into herself on the stone floor, ribs slowly surfacing beneath her fading coat, and her breaths grew quiet. She didn't roar anymore. To the visitors, she was just sleeping. But the staff knew better. Savannah wasn't sleeping. She was slipping. None of the zoo's veterinarians could explain it. They had done every test, ruled out infection, stress hormones, internal damage. All they could offer were soft words and helpless frowns. "She's grieving," one of them said, standing beside the enclosure glass, watching the lioness press her body against the cold corner wall as though trying to disappear. Animals feel loss, but this is something deeper. The keepers who worked her routine watched her with hearts quietly breaking. She no longer approached the door when they unlocked it. She no longer lifted her head when they called her name. Her golden ears barely twitched. To them, She had become a ghost before death had even found her. Her silence felt sacred, untouchable, like the quiet of a cathedral at dusk. Day by day, the visitors began to pass by her enclosure more quickly. There was nothing to see now, no movement, no grandeur, just a lioness lying in shadow, turned away, a still life of sorrow. And in the zoo's heart, inside the cage once filled with life, there was only the sound of breathing and the sound of nothing at all. The spring air hung heavy with moisture over Windermere, Oregon, blurring the line between drizzle and mist as low clouds rolled across the sky. At Windermere Zoo, the pathways glistened under the thin sheen of rain from the night before, but within the lion enclosure, time had not moved. Savannah remained curled near the corner of her den, silent and unmoving, her eyes vacant and far away. Her presence had become more ghost than animal, a heavy absence that pressed against every heart that passed her by. Emma Caldwell stood just beyond the viewing glass. Her arms crossed over a fleece-lined keeper's jacket, 2 sizes too big for her petite frame. She was only 24, a junior caretaker still new to full-time zoo work, but her eyes were steady and lined with thought. Her face was framed by loose strands of chestnut hair that slipped from a messy ponytail, and her cheeks were freckled, wind-kissed, and often smudged with dirt by noon. Animals trusted her, not because she was commanding, but because she approached them without the arrogance of control. Emma had never tried to dominate a creature, only to understand it, and she understood Savannah in a way that gnawed at her. Over the past week, Emma had watched from a distance as the lioness sank further into stillness, untouched by the changing season. No food, no reaction, no flicker of life in those once glorious amber eyes. The keepers had spoken about her in low voices. She's slipping away, and Emma couldn't shake the feeling that this was not just a biological failure, but something deeper, something that had torn Savannah's soul. It was during her early morning shift in the nursery, feeding abandoned baby goats and weighing a trio of ducklings, that the idea struck her. It wasn't a fully formed solution, not at first, but a flash of instinct that landed so suddenly she paused mid-task. What if what Savannah needed wasn't medicine, or treatment, or coaxing? What if she needed to mother? Emma knew of a small rescue farm on the outskirts of town that had taken in a litter of orphaned piglets just the previous week. Their mother had died during birth, and the tiny creatures were now living in straw-lined crates. Nursing from rubber tubes and crying out when touched, they were helpless, vulnerable, exactly the kind of beings a mother lion might feel drawn to. If only her heart could be reminded how. Emma took her idea to her supervisor first. She described it carefully, plainly, repainting the piglets' backs with non-toxic plant-based dye in light, natural stripes, introducing them into the lioness's enclosure not as trickery, but as a final attempt to reach the animal's buried instinct to nurture. The supervisor had hesitated. "Emma," she said, "you know that's not protocol." "And Savannah, she's unpredictable right now. I know," Emma replied, not flinching. "Not, but I also know she's not dying because she's sick. She's dying because she's grieving." Eventually, the supervisor passed the proposal up the chain. That's when Emma found herself sitting across from Dr. Jim Malden, the zoo's head veterinarian. Jim was a tall, broad man with heavy shoulders and tired blue eyes. At 56, his presence alone could quiet a room. He wore a simple watch on one wrist and carried a fold-out notepad in his back pocket that he never seemed to write in. Before Windermere, he'd spent 15 years as a firefighter in Portland until a collapsed stairwell ended his active career. The scar down his right arm was a silent reminder. but the experience left deeper marks in how he viewed life and death. Jim had cared for Savannah since she was a cub. He'd watched her grow from a trembling ball of fur into the queen of the Savannah exhibit. And now, he was watching her disappear. When Emma finished explaining her plan, her voice steadied by compassion, not confidence, Jim didn't answer right away. He tapped a thumb against the armrest of his chair. "You know this might not work?" Emma nodded. "It's not about that," she said. "It's about trying." He regarded her for a long, thoughtful moment before nodding slowly. "We'll need a full risk assessment. I want supervision. 2 handlers on standby and observation around the clock." Emma exhaled, more relief than breath. "Yes, sir," as she left his office. The rain began again, soft, persistent, and in that rain, Emma walked with a purpose that felt heavier than her years. She wasn't trying to save a lion's life. She was trying to save something broken inside her. Morning arrived over Windermere Zoo like a breath held too long, quiet, heavy, trembling at the edges. Mist drifted low across the treetops, and pale sunlight pierced through it in silvery shafts. It was a Tuesday, early and cold, but inside the zoo, something warmer stirred, unseen by the outside world. Emma Caldwell stood just beyond the steel gate to the lion enclosure, holding her breath without realizing it, her arms cradling a crate lined with soft hay. Inside were 5 tiny piglets, their backs streaked gently with earthy, painted stripes faint and harmless, like playful shadows pretending to be something else. Emma's hands trembled slightly as she set the crate down near the keeper's corridor. Beside her stood Jim Malden, still and unreadable in the pale light. The vet's eyes, though lined with exhaustion, remained sharp beneath the brim of his weathered baseball cap. He wore a dark jacket over his scrubs, and his stance, feet slightly apart. Hands on his belt, was steady as stone. He wasn't just watching Savannah. He was watching time, waiting to see if it would bend back toward life nearby. A third presence waited quietly. Sarah Whitmore, the zoo's behavioral specialist. Sarah was in her mid-30s, tall and slender with quiet gray eyes, and a gait that always seemed one step slower than the world expected. She had a way of observing without interrupting, her voice low and even, rarely raised. Her life had been shaped early by a traumatic car accident that had taken both her parents when she was 13. Since then, she had found peace in patterns, in animal rhythms that offered no false words or empty comfort. She had worked with wolves, elephants, even dolphins, but none had haunted her like Savannah. Savannah had not moved all morning. Her frame, stretched out in the deepest corner of the enclosure, remained curled and heavy. Her tail didn't twitch, her ears didn't flick. Her golden fur had dulled with neglect, and her ribs, once hidden under strong muscle, now cast shadows in the light. Emma gave a slight nod. Jim pressed the remote switch, and the gate slid open with a slow, mechanical sigh. The crate was nudged gently into the lioness's enclosure, then opened. The piglets blinked under the gray light, let out tentative squeals, and began to waddle into the straw-lined habitat. One tripped over its sibling, earning a louder grunt. Another nosed the ground curiously, sniffing at dried leaves and patches of old fur. They moved as all infants do, without fear, without understanding. Only one of them, the smallest, Pip, the runt of the litter, seemed hesitant, pausing halfway, his tiny legs trembling beneath him. Savannah lifted her head. Almost imperceptibly, the motion sent a ripple of silence through the observation corridor. Her eyes opened slowly, as if remembering how to see. She looked toward the movement, toward the unfamiliar sounds, the unfamiliar shapes. Her pupils narrowed, her breathing deepened, then she growled. It wasn't loud, but it was real. Her throat vibrated low, a warning drawn not from aggression, but confusion, like a question asked in the language of teeth. The piglets froze, even Pip, who had begun to inch forward again, halted mid-step. Emma's breath caught, her hands clenched at her sides. Jim's thumb hovered over the recall button. Sarah said nothing, but her eyes narrowed, studying Savannah's body posture, the set of her shoulders, the tension in her legs. It was not predatory. Then Pip moved. Not with confidence, but with the stubborn clumsiness of all baby animals. He took one trembling step forward, then another, until he was just inches from Savannah's great paw. She watched him, head still lowered. He raised his snout and, with a motion both tentative and familiar, nudged his nose gently against the fur of her foot. A sound escaped Savannah, softer than the growl. A breath. A chuff. She blinked, looked down again, and for a moment did not move. Then her massive head leaned forward, and she licked him. It was slow, deliberate, the rough rasp of her tongue moving gently over his back. The paint smudged faintly, revealing pale pink beneath. Pip squealed, more startled than hurt, but did not run. He curled beside her paw and stayed there. Emma's hands flew to her mouth. Jim slowly lowered the emergency switch. Sarah let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding. The rest of the piglets began to approach, drawn by warmth, by the magnetic pull of safety. Savannah did not growl again. She shifted her body slightly, curling her torso into a crescent, making space, one by one. They climbed over her legs, snuggled into the soft place beneath her neck, and nestled against the golden fur where her cubs had never lain. That night, Savannah ate. It wasn't much, just half her usual portion of beef and liver, but she took it without coercion. Chewing slowly as the piglet slept in a pile at her side, her eyes remained open as she chewed. She watched them sleep. Her tail flicked once. Slowly, the next morning, she licked all of them again. She let them nestle against her belly, even though there was no milk. One piglet began to suckle out of instinct. Savannah didn't stop him. She just looked off into the corner of the enclosure where, weeks ago, she had lost everything, and then turned her head back toward the living warmth pressed against her. In the corridor, Emma stood with tears on her cheeks. She remembers. She whispered. "No," Sarah murmured, her voice reverent. She never forgot. 3 weeks had passed since the piglets first entered Savannah's enclosure, and the transformation inside Windermere Zoo was no longer quiet. Spring had come early, and with it, a bloom of life not just in the soil, but in the story that had taken root behind the lion enclosure's glass. Savannah, once an echo of herself, now stretched in the morning light with piglets curled beside her. Her fur had begun to shine again under the gentle sunlight, and while she still carried the thinness of her grief, her eyes had changed, no longer hollow. They held a watchfulness, soft when they rested on the piglets, sharper when anyone approached. Her world had shifted. Her heart had bent, not broken. Sarah Whitmore had been the first to photograph it. It wasn't intentional. She'd stayed after hours, as she often did, in her quiet, measured way, with her notepad resting on her thigh and her camera set to silent shutter. Sarah, tall and willowy in her dark jeans and gray windbreaker, sat beside the glass with her legs crossed and her eyes calm. A habit she'd learned from years working in wildlife conservation. That evening, Savannah had nuzzled one of the piglets. Pip, again, with a gentleness so raw that Sarah's hand moved without thinking. The photo captured Savannah's head bent low. One paw curved protectively around the tiny creature sleeping against her chest. Sarah hadn't posted it. She wasn't the type, but she'd shown it to Emma the next day. Emma, freckled, disheveled, earnest, had stared at the image for a full minute before asking, "Can I share this?" Her voice shook slightly. Sarah nodded once. "If you believe people will see the right thing." Emma posted it to her private Instagram with a short caption. "This is Savannah. She lost all her cubs, but now she's found someone to love again." She didn't mention the piglets. She didn't explain the paint. She didn't need to. The photo was reposted within hours. By the next day, it had reached an animal welfare blog 2 days later. It was on the homepage of a major news site under the title, "Lioness Adopts Piglets in Touching Act of Healing." And then everything changed. The zoo's phone lines were flooded with calls. People asked if the story was true, if they could visit, if the piglets were safe. The local news sent a camera crew. A short segment aired one evening, and by morning, Windermere Zoo had more visitors than it had seen since the pandemic. But it wasn't just the adults who came, it was the children, specifically. A class of third graders from Oak Ridge Elementary, led by their teacher, Miss Jody Weaver, a petite woman with a halo of wild blonde curls and a voice that could hush a room without ever raising pitch. Miss Weaver had always used animals in her lessons on empathy, but when she saw the video of Savannah licking one of the piglets, she knew her students needed to do more than watch. She brought art supplies to class and asked every child to draw what they saw in Savannah's story, not the facts, but the feeling. By the end of the day, she had 100 crayon drawings. Savannah flying through stars with her piglets. Savannah with wings. Savannah as a superhero in a red cape. Some included hearts, rainbows, and even golden crowns. Each one had a note, handwritten in uneven, hopeful print. "Dear Savannah, thank you for loving them. You're the best mommy ever. You make my heart feel warm." Miss Weaver boxed the drawings, added a letter of her own, and hand-delivered them to the front gate of Windermere Zoo. Emma received them 2 days later. It was late afternoon, and the clouds hung low in the sky, threatening rain. She brought the box to the keeper's corridor outside Savannah's enclosure and opened it carefully. The smell of crayons hit her first, innocent, familiar, almost holy. She lifted each drawing with trembling fingers, smiling, crying, laughing all at once. That night, after the zoo had closed and the lights were dimmed to their evening hum, Emma sat just outside the enclosure with a stack of the letters. She didn't speak loudly. Her voice, as always, was soft and steady, meant for animals in silence. She read them one by one, pausing between each to glance at the lioness through the glass. Savannah didn't react at first. She lay, as she always did now, with Pip tucked beneath her foreleg and the others strewn across her belly like warm stones. But after Emma read the 7th letter, a short one that simply said, "I lost my baby brother too, but now I have a kitten. I think you're brave." Savannah's ear twitched. Then a sound, a low rumble, not a growl, not a purr, something between the two. Emma smiled through her tears. "Is that your answer?" she whispered. Savannah lifted her head. Her eyes met Emma's through the glass, and she let out a long, soft chuff. From then on, it became a ritual. Every night, Emma sat outside the enclosure and read. Sometimes Sarah joined her, silently sketching. Sometimes Jim would stop by on his rounds, leaning against the doorframe with arms crossed and eyes warmer than they used to be. Other children began to send letters too, some with drawings, some with folded origami animals, some with stories of their own grief. A girl in Nebraska sent a photo of herself with her 3-legged rescue dog, saying, "I think Savannah would like him. He's good at snuggles." The zoo staff started posting the letters near the lion exhibit, decorating the outer viewing deck with a rotating gallery of hope. People stopped not just to look, but to kneel, to cry, to remember that sometimes healing doesn't look like returning to what was. Sometimes it looks like finding something new to hold on to. The spring wind of Windermere. Oregon carried a different kind of breath this year. It was gentler now, brushing through tall cedar trees, scattering petals from the cherry blossoms that framed the entrance to the zoo. A whole year had passed since the piglets entered Savannah's life. 12 seasons of healing, small miracles, and the kind of love that doesn't ask for resemblance to be real. Savannah now stood tall beneath the filtered sunlight in her expanded enclosure, her fur glinting gold like the first day she ever walked its perimeter as a cub. Her stride had returned, not quite as fierce, but filled with a quiet confidence that told of survival. Surrounding her, 5 stout, round-bellied pigs snorted and scurried through mounds of fresh hay and scattered leaves. They had long outgrown the camouflage paint and their little lion-like markings, but none of them had left Savannah's side. To her, they were still cubs, and to the public, they had become something more, symbols of grace, motherhood, and second chances, the new habitat, a sunlit, half-acre sanctuary with both open plains and shaded dens, had been christened just last week with a brass plaque that read Savannah's Pride. It had been Jim Malden's idea, his way of reminding the world that pride wasn't always about bloodlines or appearances, but connection. Jim, now nearing 57, still wore the same worn field jacket, though the shoulders had grown looser and the color faded around the seams. He was slower on his rounds, more deliberate, but his presence still steadied every young keeper and intern. His arm, once stiff from the firefighting accident that had ended his previous career, now moved with ease thanks to months of quiet physical therapy and the stretching habits Emma had insisted he adopt. Emma Caldwell stood beside him on the overlook platform, her badge now reading Senior Animal Supervisor. Her hair was longer, tied into a low braid, and her posture more upright, more assured. She wore dark green keeper's cargo pants and a black polo with the Windermere logo on her chest. But it was the worn, leather-bound notebook in her hand that defined her presence more than the uniform. She had begun journaling again shortly after Savannah accepted the piglets as her own, every night after feeding rounds. She would sit on the small bench outside the enclosure and write. Only these entries weren't for herself. They were letters to her mother, Emma's mother. Lynn Caldwell had been a bright spirit dulled by grief, after losing a second pregnancy when Emma was just 10. Lynn had begun to disappear behind silent dinners and long naps in the middle of the day. Emma remembered once finding her mother staring at the dryer, unmoving, a baby sock clutched tightly in one hand. No one talked about it. No one said miscarriage, but the silence in their house grew louder than any explanation could have. Emma learned to tiptoe, to soothe herself, to speak more to the barn animals than to people. It wasn't until Savannah's journey mirrored the one that had shaped her childhood that Emma realized she had never healed either. She began to write. Dear Mom, Savannah lay down again today, but not like before. This time. She curled around Pip like a cradle, and I saw her eyes close with peace. It made me think of the day you watched the rain fall and whispered you were tired. I wish I'd asked more. I wish I'd stayed, through Savannah's rebirth. Emma learned to forgive not just her mother, but herself. Each letter became less about grief and more about gratitude by the end of the year. The journal held over 100 entries, and though Lynn would never read them, Emma finally felt heard in the sanctuary below. The piglets, now rounded and muddy with adolescence, bumbled after one another. Clover, the most stubborn of the bunch, head-butted a hay bale while Benny rolled in the dirt beside her. Savannah padded between them, occasionally pausing to nudge one with her paw or press her nose to their backs in a half-grooming ritual that seemed more spiritual than instinctual. A young boy near the viewing rail gasped loudly, "Is that a pig with a lion?" His mother, crouched beside him, smiled. "That's Savannah. She chose them." Jim chuckled under his breath. "They used to ask if she was confused. Now they say she's brave." Emma smiled but said nothing. Her gaze remained on Savannah, who had climbed onto the central rock ledge, now known as her throne among staff. The Lioness stood tall, scanning the crowd, the trees, the sky. Then it happened. She lifted her head and roared. It wasn't a cry of hunger or fear. It was something deeper, louder than grief, fuller than survival. The sound cut through the air like sunlight through fog. People stopped walking. Children turned wide-eyed. Even the birds in the pines scattered into silence. It was a roar of joy. It had been over 2 years since Savannah's last true roar, and none had heard it since the day she lost her last cub. But here it was again, rising from her chest and shaking the very bones of the earth below. She turned slowly, surveying the scene, then stepped back down to nuzzle Pip, now a full-grown pig with tufts of bristled hair behind his ears and the most tender disposition of them all. "She's claiming them again," Sarah said quietly. She had joined them on the platform without a sound, as usual. Her long frame cast a slight shadow across the bench as she leaned against the rail, sketchbook open in her arms. Jim nodded. No need to prove anything. She just knows. The three of them stood in silence for a long moment. Then Emma, almost shyly, opened her notebook and read softly, just loud enough for the wind to carry the words. "Dear Mom, she roared today, and I think it was for both of us. In a world where appearances often define our judgments and love is too easily measured by blood, Savannah's story reminds us of something far more sacred, that love is not bound by form, but by the heart that gives it, a lioness, broken by loss, found healing not through power or science, but through the tender, quiet grace of unexpected life. What seemed impossible became possible when someone dared to believe in second chances. Maybe that's not just coincidence. Maybe that's a miracle, a whisper from God reminding us that healing often comes in the most unlikely shapes. Each day, we pass by hearts grieving in silence, people worn by sorrow, souls aching for hope. What if, like Emma, we dared to reach across that silence with compassion? What if, like Savannah, we opened our hearts to what love looked like, not in perfection, but in presence? This story isn't just about a lioness and 5 piglets. It's about you. It's about the pain you've carried and the miracles you've missed because they came wrapped in unfamiliar forms. And perhaps it's also about how God never stops trying to reach us, even through the quiet, even through loss. So if this story moved you, share it, comment on it. Subscribe to this channel if you believe love is still stronger than sorrow. And above all, drop a comment with just one word, Amen. Not just for Savannah, but for the wounded hearts still waiting to roar again. May God bless every soul who needed this story today.